Look, I'm going to talk today really mostly about what I do as a curator here at the National Museum, but I want to try and draw some kind of generalities from that in terms of how there's a series of curatorial practices, if you like, tools and techniques and methods that I think could be of interest to your students and of interest to you in developing extension history courses. I want to talk about what I do as a curator, and then from that also talk a little bit about the kinds of history that I think museums are particularly good at creating and communicating. I think this is something I'd really like to discuss because I think it's not very well understood that museums, as Dave insisted by putting up my quote at the beginning of in his slide, is that I think museums create a very particular kind of history. It's not the kind of history that gets created in books or indeed in films or in compositions. It's a very particular kind of history that grows out of the fact that museums are centrally interested and defined by their collections. I should say that's not an uncontested view of museums, but it's certainly my view of museums. So curators try to understand material culture as evidence of other people's lives, as a means to try to understand other people, what they looked like, what they did, how they made a living, what they hoped for in their lives, how they tried to construct their world, and why they made particular choices. And one way in which curators differ from other historians is therefore in focus in terms of how we interrogate the past, what elements we use to communicate the past. Most academic historians are trained very much in the discipline of words, and they concentrate on words still today, I think, although it's changing a little bit.
If you think about light bulbs, they're an enormous infrastructure. They're in every building in the world, more or less. They have kind of a privileged position above us, around us. They can see, if you think about it, most parts of any room. The kind of key was to say, well, what if we consider a light bulb not to be a light bulb, but actually to be a digital projector? It just happens to be really low resolution. In fact, it's a 1 by 1 pixel digital projector. Turn on the wall switch, and giant pixel comes out and paints your room. Okay, well, that's ludicrous, but what if you put a higher resolution projector inside that same familiar glass bulb? Well, now you have a device that can illuminate. If you turn on all the pixels the same color, you still have a light bulb in the usual sense. But if you turn on the pixels different amounts and different colors, then you're kind of projecting information out into the world. And if at the same time that you're doing that, you put a little tiny camera inside the bulb, then not only is information flowing out of the glass, but you're collecting optical information. So screw one of those into every one of these fixtures, and suddenly you have a means, potentially, to put display and interaction everywhere throughout the world.
We are led to believe that basically much of eastern North America was heavily cloaked in mature forest that today we covet as old growth, and yet at one time it was the sort of ancestral botanical blanket that covered much of certainly Massachusetts and New England. Certainly one of the first things that happened as increasing waves of colonists arrived was the need to clear the land. And this clearing of the land is something that started really in the form of small subsistence farms, are today sort of what we find in the lattice work of stone walls that one can find practically anywhere on the landscape if it's in a relatively untouched condition. By the early part of the 19th century, it's thought that generally the zenith of clearing had taken place sometime in the 1830s, 1840s, and the trees and the forests were essentially clear-cut to an extent that is almost unbelievable.
A new study in the BMJ outlines the role that general practitioners will have to play in commercial spaceflight. After all, astronauts typically have to be in tip-top shape, but opening the door to the paying public means that less healthy individuals will soon have access to space too. And the stress of spaceflight, combined with the negative effects of weightlessness on muscle and bone, could cause real problems. It may be up to your personal physician to make the go, no-go call based on your medical history. Among the potential hypotheticals floated in the BMJ study, can my patient with stable angina and a pacemaker for complete heart block participate in a suborbital Virgin Galactic flight? What is the maximum allowable time that my patient with osteoporosis can spend on a planned vacation at a space hotel? There are no official answers, yet.
A study finds that elephants can be in true danger in the heat. As creatures get bigger, they have smaller surface area to body volume ratios. Fully grown Asian elephants thus pack a lot of mass into a body with a relatively small surface area, and surface area limits how much body heat you can dissipate. For the study, two female elephants in the Audubon Zoo in New Orleans walked around a half-mile track under various conditions. The outdoor temperature during these sessions ranged from a chilly 8 degrees Celsius to a scorching 35 degrees. Sunny, hot days were the worst. The already limited hide is now itself heated by the sun. With the equivalent of a busted radiator, the elephants retained 56 to 100% of their body heat internally, which could make a mere 4 hours of exercise fatal. The research on elephant exertion is in the Journal of Experimental Biology. Fortunately, elephants have ways to beat the heat. Shift activity to after dark and, of course, go for a dip.
Let's make one point very clear at the outset. Oftentimes I get student papers that refer to Beethoven's Fifth Song or Tchaikovsky's First Piano Song. Is that right? No, that's not good at all. Are these songs? What do you have to make something a song? Lyrics. You got to have a text. So we don't have, in 80% of classical music, we don't have lyrics. We don't have a text. Well, yes, with opera, of course, but the other 80% is purely instrumental music. It works its magic, again, through purely instrumental means. So we can't really call those songs. And this puzzled me. But one day I was sitting there at iTunes and I wanted to buy an interior movement of a Mozart serenade. So I was all set to purchase this, and it said, buy song. Boom. That told me the answer. That's where this terminology comes into play. Because on iTunes, we buy songs. It could be purely instrumental, but it's called buy a song. But we don't want to use that sort of parlance. We want to be a bit more sophisticated than that, if you will, and use other terms. So we'll talk generally about Beethoven's composition, or Beethoven's piece, or Beethoven's work, or his masterwork, or chef d'oeuvre, however fancy you want to get with it.
Dr. Tony Wagner believes there are 7 skills that young people need to have in order for them to find and keep a good job in today's economy. But he thinks our schools are focusing too much on tests and academic performance and aren't doing enough to teach those skills. Let me give you an example. One of Wagner's 7 skills is the ability to work in an international team. This is because little teamwork is carried out in one building anymore. When most global companies have a problem, they create teams of people from all over the world to solve it. And these people meet online, in virtual meeting rooms. To succeed in this kind of environment, you need to be a good communicator and understand different cultures. Teams also need good leaders who lead by influencing others, but Wagner and the business people he interviewed say that young people today are unprepared for teamwork and leadership. Because of this, Wagner thinks that people involved in teaching and learning must rethink the way that they educate people in schools so that these young people have the skills they need to achieve a successful career in the 21st century.
A 140 years later, watching yet another Hollywood remake of King Kong, I was struck by what a poor choice of monster a giant gorilla makes. Gorillas are, for the most part, peaceful vegetarians who live in remote jungle far from humans. The common urban cat, by contrast, is considerably more ferocious. Unlike gorillas, cats are vicious predators and ruthlessly territorial animals that fight and kill regularly. They also have scary claws. Aside from British comedians The Goodies, however, no one has seriously considered making Kitten Kong movies. For once, Hollywood is not to blame for our irrationality. Gorillas captivate our imaginations because of their obvious similarity to humans. But the origin of our fascination with gorillas as violent monsters can probably be blamed on Charles Darwin.
And one of the major lessons that we've learned is that diversity masks unity. And what I mean by that is that we are so attuned to noticing differences between things, and even differences between people, for example, because it's a tremendous survival advantage for us to recognize a lot of different people and know which ones are our friends and which ones are likely to stab us in the back. It really, really allows you to human beings to prosper. But that keen awareness of diversity actually masks some extraordinary, remarkable unifying principles in living organisms.
As I mentioned last week, we're going to look today at fiction writing, writing stories, and in particular at authors who have a reputation for creating characters in their books who are known as unreliable narrators. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, originally in the 19th century, it tended to simply mean that as a reader, you just couldn't trust what the narrator of a story was telling you. This might have been because they were not giving you important information, or because they themselves, as a character in their own story, lacked some kind of personal insight. In later works of literature, this unreliability was used by authors more deliberately, with the direct intention of making a story more complicated for a reader to understand, perhaps a crime novel or a thriller. Nowadays, there's a lot more humour in unreliable narration, and it's often used to make first-person characters enjoyable to read about. So, what all that tells us as a general starting point is that this type of narration
We learn most about ourselves and the way we function, both physically and mentally, when things go wrong. For a long time, it was thought that the brain acted as a whole in governing the body's functions. Then, in 1861, Paul Broca, a French anatomist and anthropologist, discovered that different parts of the brain perform different functions. After carrying out a post-mortem examination on a patient who had had a severe speech impediment, he discovered, as he had expected, damage to a section of the left frontal lobe of the brain. The left side of the brain governs language ability. The patient's problem had been that he could only utter one syllable, though he fully
According to a new study, a more diverse population of intestinal bacteria is linked to better health. The work is in the journal Nature. Danish researchers gathered gut microbes from almost 300 obese and non-obese adults. The intestines of roughly 1 in 4 participants contained fewer and less diverse bacteria than average, and members of this group were more likely to be obese and to suffer from gut inflammation. By looking for only a few specific bacteria, researchers could predict whether a subject fell into the low-diversity group. Certain species could even indicate whether an individual was slim or overweight, and these microbial markers might also serve as signs of future health risks, because low-diversity participants who were obese were more likely to gain additional weight over time. But a low-diversity gut won't necessarily doom your health. According to another study in the same journal, it's possible to increase microbial diversity by developing a decent diet.
Back in 1971, the Soviet lander Mars 3 scored the first soft landing on the red planet, but it operated for only about 15 seconds and then failed. Since that time, Mars 3 has been little more than a historic interplanetary paperweight, its exact resting place unknown. Now a team of amateur researchers may have located the defunct lander. Using imagery taken by NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2007, the searchers spotted an object that could be Mars 3. Nearby, they also turned up what may be the lander's descent module and heat shield, as well as an unusually bright spot that could be the parachute. All 4 items are in the expected landing area. A follow-up photo of the region acquired by the NASA Orbiter in March has strengthened the case, but the researchers will keep poring over the available imagery to make sure. Unfortunately, there's no way to get a closer look.
The new law was harder to impose than the government thought.
The cotton industry purchased all its raw cotton from abroad.
It is possible to keep the energy of an atom in two ways. We are able to accommodate more students than previously. He wrote poetry and plays as well as scientific paper. Our aim is to transmit the mathematics teaching in the classroom.
Evidence suggests that the human brain changes shape in response to the way it is used.